Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today, a hidden diary exposes a family's chilling secret. It all began on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Azari and Ezael Anderson decided to clean out the attic of their suburban home. The attic had been neglected for years, its dusty boxes and forgotten belongings a testament to the passage of time. Sunlight filtered through a small, grimy window, casting streaks of golden light over the cluttered space. Azari, with a scarf tied around her head to protect against cobwebs, handed boxes down to Ezael, who stacked them carefully near the ladder. As Azari sifted through a stack of old Christmas decorations, her fingers brushed against something unusual. Nestled among the tangle of lights and tinsel was a small, leather-bound diary. It was unassuming, its brown cover worn and slightly cracked, with faint traces of mildew clinging to its surface. Azari hesitated, her curiosity piqued. The box it was in had no label, and she couldn't remember ever seeing the diary before. "Look at this," she called down to Ezael, who glanced up from the floor below. She climbed down the ladder, holding the diary carefully as though it might crumble in her hands. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Azari opened the diary. The pages were yellowed with age, and an odd, faint smell of damp paper wafted up as she flipped through. The first few pages were empty, but as she turned further, her stomach dropped. Taped onto one of the pages was a photograph of a young woman. She had a bright smile, her hair tucked behind her ears, and appeared to be in her 20s. Beneath the photo was a series of notes written in small, precise handwriting. The words described details about the woman, her name, where she worked, what time she typically left her house, and even the park she often visited with her dog. Azari felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly flipped to the next page. Another photo, another woman, with more unsettlingly specific details jotted beneath it. Each page she turned revealed the same pattern, a photograph of a young woman paired with personal information. By the time she reached the middle of the diary, her hands were trembling. Ezael crouched beside her, alarmed by her pale expression. He reached out, gently taking the diary from her hands. His eyes scanned the pages, and his brow furrowed in disbelief. "What is this?" he muttered, though the question was more to himself than to Azari. As they continued flipping through the diary together, they noticed the dates written at the top of each page. The earliest entries were nearly a decade old, while the most recent was dated just 2 months prior. The realization struck them simultaneously, leaving them both cold with dread. The handwriting looked disturbingly familiar. It was their son Kieran's. Neither could speak for a moment. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of what they were uncovering. Azari clutched her chest, her breath shallow. Ezael quickly stood, pacing the room as he held the diary tightly in his hands. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the son he knew, a quiet, withdrawn young man, with the disturbing evidence before him. Azari's thoughts spiraled into panic. She replayed moments from Kieran's childhood and teenage years, searching for any signs she might have missed. Kieran had always been reserved, but nothing in his behavior had ever hinted at something this dark. Still, the undeniable proof lay before them. Their son had been secretly chronicling the lives of strangers, and some of those strangers might have been harmed. Driven by a mix of fear and disbelief, Ezael began flipping back to the earlier pages, searching for something, anything, that might explain the situation. It was then they noticed a chilling detail. Certain entries included the word taken scrawled in red ink. Each time it appeared, it was underlined multiple times, standing out starkly against the neat black handwriting that filled the rest of the pages. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as they absorbed the implications. Kieran had been tracking these women, documenting their lives and possibly taking them. Their unease deepened as they realized how long this had been going on. The idea that their son had been capable of such meticulous planning, let alone the acts implied by the diary, was incomprehensible. Desperation set in as Azari and Ezael realized the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Clutching the diary tightly, Isel suggested they search the rest of the attic for more evidence. Perhaps there was something else hidden among the boxes that could explain or even contradict what they had found. Azari reluctantly agreed, though a deep, gnawing fear told her they were only beginning to scratch the surface of a dark and horrifying truth. Azari and Isel sat in stunned silence after discovering the diary, the weight of their revelation bearing down on them like a physical force. Their son Chiron, the quiet, unassuming young man they had raised, was now at the center of something dark and incomprehensible. As the shock wore off, a sense of urgency took its place. The entries in the diary were not just idle scribblings or harmless musings. They revealed a pattern, a chilling, deliberate routine that Chiron had followed for years. Azari, desperate to understand, spread the diary open on the kitchen table and began to analyze its contents more closely. Each page chronicled the lives of different women, written in Chiron's neat, precise handwriting. The level of detail was staggering. It wasn't just their names and routines. Chiron had documented their preferences, their favorite places to eat, the books they read, even the friends they spent time with. The descriptions were disturbingly intimate, as if he had been silently observing every aspect of their lives. What stood out most was the progression in the diary entries. The early pages showed simple observations, notes on physical appearances, and schedules. But as the years went on, the entries grew darker, more invasive. Chiron began noting vulnerabilities, such as whether someone lived alone, if they had a regular jogging route in secluded areas, or if they had mentioned feeling unsafe to others. The word taken appeared again and again, each time underlined in bold strokes of red ink, marking the presumed end of his interest in a particular woman. Azari's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the lines for some clue, some explanation for why Chiron had done this. Aziel, unable to sit still, began searching Chiron's room for anything that could shed light on the situation. His first stop was Chiron's closet, where he found boxes of seemingly random items, old tools, notebooks, and scraps of paper. But hidden behind a pile of clothes was a small locked chest. Using a screwdriver, Aziel pried the chest open. Inside, he found a disturbing collection of items, receipts for purchases of camping gear, zip ties, gloves, and rolls of duct tape. There were also maps of nearby parks and hiking trails, with certain areas circled in red. Alongside these items was a stack of Polaroid photos, images of women who matched the descriptions in the diary. The photos were candid, taken from a distance, and most of the women were unaware they were being photographed. Meanwhile, Azari had taken her investigation online. She began cross-referencing the names and details in the diary with local news reports and missing person cases. It didn't take long for her to uncover the horrifying truth. Several of the women featured in Chiron's diary had been reported missing over the years. The dates of their disappearances matched the timeline of the diary entries, further solidifying the connection. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Azari and Aziel couldn't deny what was becoming increasingly clear: their son had been systematically tracking, and potentially harming, these women. Azari's heart ached as she tried to reconcile the image of her son as a shy, introverted boy with the calculated predator described in the pages of the diary. She thought back to Chiron's teenage years, searching for any red flags she might have missed. While he had always been quiet and withdrawn, she never imagined those traits could mask something so sinister. As the reality sank in, a sense of dread consumed the couple. They began questioning everything they thought they knew about their son. Aziel remembered how Chiron would spend hours in the garage, tinkering with tools and gadgets. At the time it seemed like a harmless hobby, but now it felt ominous. Azari recalled Chiron's habit of disappearing for long stretches of time without explanation, always brushing off questions with vague answers about needing space. Despite their growing fear, the Andersons knew they couldn't ignore what they had found. Azari suggested they search for more evidence, hoping to uncover something that might provide clarity or perhaps exonerate Chiron. Aziel reluctantly agreed, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him they were only uncovering the tip of an iceberg far more horrifying than they could imagine. Every new piece of evidence they uncovered painted a clearer picture of Kyron's actions. The carefully hidden stash in his room, the detailed observations in the diary, and the overlap with missing persons cases all pointed to one undeniable truth: Kyron had been leading a double life. The quiet, introverted son they thought they knew was someone entirely different in the shadows. Azari and Iziel sat in their kitchen late into the night, the diary and its damning contents spread out before them. They felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. As the sun began to rise, they were left with a single haunting question: what had their son done, and how far had he gone? Terrified by the mounting evidence, Azari and Iziel knew they couldn't handle the situation on their own. The thought of involving the authorities was terrifying, but the gravity of their discovery left them no choice. Early the next morning, they contacted the police, their voices shaking as they explained what they had found. Within hours, detectives arrived at their suburban home, bringing an air of tense professionalism that filled the room. Azari handed over the diary and Kyron's belongings, her hands trembling as she recounted the horrifying details they had pieced together. The detectives took the evidence seriously, their grim expressions mirroring Azari and Iziel's growing fear. They photographed the diary, scanned the photographs, and bagged the contents of the locked chest from Kyron's room. As the investigation began, the couple watched helplessly, their home transformed into the focal point of a potential criminal case. Forensic experts quickly confirmed what the Andersons already suspected: Kyron's fingerprints were all over the diary and its contents. More troublingly, the photographs and notes matched multiple missing person reports from the past decade. The detectives were meticulous, linking the dates and locations mentioned in the diary to specific disappearances. It was as if the pages themselves had become a roadmap leading straight into the heart of a chilling series of crimes. One piece of evidence stood out among the rest. Surveillance footage from a gas station, dated just a day before one of the disappearances, showed Kyron standing near the pump, his car in the background. The location was only a few miles from the last known sighting of one of the victims. While Kyron wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious in the footage, his presence so close to the crime scene added another layer of suspicion. The case took a dramatic turn when detectives followed a paper trail leading to a storage unit rented under Kyron's name. The unit, located on the outskirts of town, had been paid for in cash for years, with no indication it existed in Kyron's day-to-day life. Armed with a warrant, the police opened the storage unit, uncovering a grim and disturbing scene. Inside the unit, they found personal belongings from several missing women. Jewelry, articles of clothing, and even small keepsakes like handwritten notes and photographs were neatly organized in labeled boxes. The items were unmistakably linked to some of the victims whose cases had gone cold. The evidence was damning, suggesting that Kyron had not only stalked these women, but also kept trophies from each of his presumed crimes. The most chilling discovery, however, was a small, makeshift room at the back of the storage unit. It was outfitted with an old mattress, restraints, and a single, flickering light bulb. Detectives believed this space had been used to hold the victims before their fates were sealed. When the detectives informed Azari and Iziel about the findings, the couple was overcome with a mix of horror and disbelief. Their home, once a safe haven, now felt like a house of secrets, its walls echoing with the weight of Kyron's possible crimes. The media caught wind of the investigation, and soon the Andersons found themselves at the center of a storm. Reporters gathered outside their home, cameras flashing as they tried to piece together the story. Friends and neighbors whispered behind their backs, their once close community now wary and distant. Azari and Iziel couldn't escape the judgment, the pointed stares, or the unspoken questions: how could they not have known? As the police continued their work, Kyron himself remained missing. Attempts to locate him yielded no results, and his phone had been turned off for days. The couple's fear grew with each passing hour. They dreaded the idea of their son being arrested, but they also feared what he might be capable of if left unchecked. For the detectives, the case was clear-cut in many ways. The physical evidence linked Chiron to the missing women, and his behavior fit the profile of a predator. Yet, questions lingered. Why had Chiron started this pattern of behavior? What had driven him to such dark extremes? And most importantly, where was he now? The Andersons, overwhelmed and emotionally shattered, were left to grapple with their growing realization their son was no longer the person they thought they knew. The boy they had raised, the quiet and withdrawn young man they had supported, was a stranger, a shadowy figure at the center of a web of unimaginable crimes. As the investigation unfolded, they could only wait and hope for answers, even as they feared what those answers might reveal. The search for Chiron intensified as detectives expanded their investigation, focusing on his movements over the past few months. Law enforcement combed through security footage, financial records, and phone data, but Chiron seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Each day without progress heightened the tension, both for the police and for Azari and Isael, who remained trapped in a nightmare of their son's making. While detectives worked to track Chiron down, the media frenzy surrounding the case escalated. News outlets dissected every detail, speculating wildly about Chiron's whereabouts and motives. Photos of the Anderson family home were splashed across headlines, with sensationalized stories questioning whether Azari and Isael had turned a blind eye to their son's actions. Strangers online offered unsolicited opinions, accusing the couple of being complicit or neglectful, as if they had somehow known all along. The weight of public scrutiny added to their anguish, leaving them isolated and reeling. Meanwhile, the police continued to uncover disturbing pieces of Chiron's hidden life. They tracked purchases he had made in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, finding receipts for camping equipment, non-perishable food, and prepaid phone cards. This evidence suggested he had planned to go off the grid, and it painted a picture of someone who had anticipated being pursued. Investigators speculated that Chiron's knowledge of his family discovering the diary had triggered his flight. Azari spent hours replaying the events of that fateful day in her mind, haunted by the image of Chiron's handwriting filling the pages of the diary. She couldn't reconcile the quiet, withdrawn son she had known with the cold and calculated predator the evidence suggested. Her grief was compounded by guilt, a constant whisper in her mind questioning what she might have missed or failed to address in Chiron's upbringing. Isael, though equally distraught, channeled his emotions into action. He assisted the investigators by providing details about Chiron's habits, routines, and the places he had frequented as a child. He recalled a remote cabin the family had rented years ago for a camping trip, a secluded spot deep in the woods that Chiron had loved. This memory struck a chord with detectives, who immediately added the location to their search efforts. When officers arrived at the cabin, they found signs that someone had been there recently. The small space was in disarray, with empty food wrappers, discarded clothing, and traces of a campfire outside. Though Chiron himself was nowhere to be found, the items left behind offered clues about his state of mind. Notebooks filled with disjointed thoughts and cryptic symbols were strewn across the cabin's table, along with maps marked with routes leading deeper into the wilderness. The discovery of the cabin added urgency to the search. It was clear that Chiron was still on the move, evading capture with a calculated precision that made him even more dangerous. Investigators theorized that he might be hiding in the dense forest surrounding the area, using his knowledge of survival tactics to stay ahead of them. Back at home, Azari and Isael were left in limbo, the absence of answers weighing heavily on them. They were consumed by fear not only for the victims connected to the case but also for their son. Despite everything, a part of them still clung to the hope that Chiron could be found alive and that, somehow, an explanation would emerge to make sense of the chaos he had caused. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The police expanded their search radius, enlisting specialized teams to comb the forest and nearby areas. Tips from the public poured in, though most led to dead ends. Chiron seemed to have vanished, leaving behind only fragments of his actions and a trail of unanswered questions. The more time passed, the more the Andersons felt the crushing weight of their situation. Their once normal life had been shattered, and there was no returning to the way things had been. Azari found herself pacing the house at night, unable to sleep, while Isel spent hours poring over news reports and updates from the investigation. The tension came to a head when law enforcement discovered a campsite deep within the woods. The site, though abandoned, bore Chiron's unmistakable marks, more cryptic notes, traces of his survival preparations, and evidence that he had been monitoring the news coverage of his case. It was clear he was aware of the hunt for him and was determined to stay ahead of it. For Azari and Isel, the discovery was both a relief and a torment. Chiron was alive, but he was still out there, evading capture and leaving a trail of uncertainty and fear in his wake. As the search continued, the Andersons were left to confront the painful truth: the son they had loved and nurtured was now a fugitive, and the shadow he cast over their lives would never fully lift. The break in the case came when a hiker stumbled across a makeshift shelter deep in the forest. It was crudely constructed, with branches and tarps providing minimal cover, but what stood out most were the items left behind. Among them was a set of handwritten notes that mirrored the diary found in Chiron's room. The entries were more frantic, less calculated, filled with cryptic phrases and ominous reflections on guilt, control, and escape. Investigators were certain that the shelter had been Chiron's most recent hideout, but it was clear he had moved on. Forensic teams scoured the site, uncovering signs that Chiron had been monitoring the area for weeks. Remnants of food supplies, fresh footprints, and the faint smell of extinguished fires pointed to his presence not long before. Despite their proximity, Chiron had managed to stay one step ahead of the search efforts, using the dense forest to his advantage. This discovery reignited the hunt, with authorities deploying tracking dogs and aerial surveillance in an effort to corner him. Back at home, Azari and Isel were informed of the developments, their emotions a mix of relief and dread. On one hand, they felt closer to closure; on the other, they feared what might happen if Chiron was found. Would he resist arrest? Would he confess to the crimes laid at his feet? The uncertainty gnawed at them, compounded by the media's unrelenting focus on their family. As the search intensified, another disturbing revelation came to light. Investigators connected Chiron to an unsolved murder that had occurred several years earlier in a neighboring town. The victim, a young woman whose name appeared in the diary, had been found in a wooded area under suspicious circumstances. Though the case had gone cold, evidence from Chiron's belongings, including a piece of jewelry belonging to the victim, provided the link needed to reopen it. This discovery solidified Chiron's role as a predator, erasing any lingering doubts about his guilt. The turning point came weeks later when authorities tracked Chiron to an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the wilderness. The cabin, hidden from view and accessible only by foot, was surrounded by dense vegetation, making it the perfect hideout. As officers approached, they found Chiron sitting outside, disheveled and visibly worn. He made no attempt to flee, instead raising his hands in silent surrender. The arrest was surreal for Azari and Isel, who were notified immediately. Seeing their son's face flash across news screens, handcuffed and escorted by police, was a devastating moment. The once quiet boy they had raised now appeared as a hollowed-out shell of the person they thought they knew. During the interrogation, Chiron remained eerily calm, offering no explanations or defenses. He neither confirmed nor denied the allegations against him, his silence only adding to the chilling aura that surrounded him. Authorities pieced together his crimes using the evidence they had collected, presenting a damning narrative of calculated stalking, abductions, and possible murders. The trial that followed captured national attention, with every detail of Chiron's double life laid bare for the world to see. Prosecutors painted a picture of a cold, methodical predator, while the defense attempted to argue mental instability. For Azari and Isel, the trial was an excruciating ordeal, forcing them to confront, not only the crimes Kyron had committed but also the public's relentless judgment. Ultimately, Kyron was convicted on multiple charges, including kidnapping and murder. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to the victims' families, but for Azari and Iziel, it marked the beginning of a lifelong struggle to reconcile their love for their son with the horrors he had inflicted. They moved away from their home, seeking anonymity and a chance to rebuild their shattered lives. In the end, the case of Kieran Anderson became a cautionary tale, a story of darkness hiding in plain sight. For his parents, it was a haunting reminder that even those closest to us can harbor unimaginable secrets. As they attempted to move forward, they carried with them the weight of unanswered questions, the heaviest of all being, could they have prevented it?